The Galactic Council had ruled over the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never met a species quite like humanity. When the first human ship stumbled through a natural wormhole and appeared in Council space in the year 2247, the aliens who found them were not surprised because new species emerged from primitive worlds all the time, and the Council had long ago perfected the art of welcoming them into the fold. Ambassador Veltries of the Deshan Consortium was chosen to make first contact because the Deshans were masters of diplomacy and trade, and they knew exactly how to handle young species who had just discovered they were not alone in the universe. Veltries traveled to Earth with a delegation of 40 officials, and he stood before the United Nations Space Authority with a smile that showed too many teeth, and he offered humanity everything they could ever want. He offered them faster than light travel, because human ships were slow and primitive, and would take centuries to reach even the nearest stars without help. He offered them access to galactic markets where they could trade for medicines that cured any disease and materials stronger than anything Earth could produce, and technology that would advance human civilization by thousands of years. He offered them protection from the dangerous species that lurked in the dark spaces between stars, because the galaxy was not a safe place and young species often disappeared before they ever had a chance to grow. The humans listened to all of this with wide eyes and grateful smiles, and they asked what the Council wanted in return. Veltries explained that the terms were simple and reasonable and designed only to maintain peace and order in the galaxy. Humanity would cap their population at 15 billion because resources were limited, and the Council needed to manage growth carefully across all member species. Humanity would restrict their colonies to 12 approved star systems because expansion needed to be controlled and monitored for the good of everyone. Humanity would submit all military research and development to Council review because weapons were dangerous, and a Council needed to ensure that no species built anything that could threaten the peace. The human leaders looked at each other, and they whispered among themselves, and then they smiled, and they signed the treaty without argument. Veltries returned to the Council chambers and reported that the integration of humanity had been a complete success, and the new species would be productive members of galactic civilization within a generation. The Council congratulated themselves on another job well done, because they had been doing this for 12,000 years, and they knew exactly how the story would unfold. The humans would accept their place in the hierarchy, and they would trade and grow within their allowed limits, and they would be grateful for the scraps of technology and territory the Council permitted them to have. This was how it always worked, because every species eventually realized that fighting the Council was pointless, and that obedience was the only path to survival. But the Council had made a mistake. That would take them 30 years to discover. They had assumed that humans were like every other species they had encountered, and they had not bothered to look deeper into human history or human nature. If they had looked, they would have seen that humans came from a world of constant competition where nations rose and fell and empires were built and destroyed in the span of centuries. They would have seen that humans had fought each other for resources and territory and ideology for tens of thousands of years, and that they had developed a talent for deception and strategy that no other species in the galaxy could match. They would have seen that humans smiled when they were angry and said yes when they meant no, and shook hands while planning betrayal. But the Council did not look because they were arrogant and because they believed that no primitive species from a backwater world could ever threaten their power. For the first 10 years, everything seemed normal. Humanity expanded to their 12 approved worlds, and they established colonies and trade routes, and they submitted their technology for inspection exactly as the treaty required. Council observers visited human space regularly, and they reported that everything was in order and that the humans were behaving exactly as expected. But the observers only saw what the humans wanted them to see. Deep in the asteroid belts of human space, there were stations that did not appear on any official map, and in those stations, human scientists worked day and night to reverse engineer every piece of alien technology the Council had given them. They took apart the faster-than-light drives, and they figured out how they worked, and then they built better ones that were 3 times faster and completely undetectable by Council sensors. They studied the weapons that a Council species used, and they developed counters for all of them, and then they designed new weapons based on principles that no other species had ever considered. They built ships in secret shipyards, hidden inside hollowed-out moons, and they trained crews in simulation chambers that prepared them for battles Council could never imagine. And while all of this was happening, the humans kept smiling and nodding and submitting their fake research reports and hosting Council inspectors who never thought to look beyond what they were shown. The population cap of 15 billion was a joke because humanity had been building hidden colonies in uncharted systems since the 5th year of the treaty, and by the 20th year, there were more than 100 billion humans living on worlds the Council did not know existed. The military restrictions were equally meaningless because every weapon humanity showed to Council inspectors was deliberately inferior, and the real weapons were stored in armories that existed only in classified databases. Human intelligence agencies had infiltrated every level of Council bureaucracy, and they knew the names of every spy the Council had placed in human space, and they fed those spies carefully crafted lies that painted a picture of a docile and obedient species. It was the greatest deception in galactic history, and not a single member of the Council suspected a thing. Ambassador Veltris received commendations for his successful integration of humanity, and he gave speeches about how the humans were a model for other young species to follow. He had no idea that the humans were laughing at him behind closed doors, and that they had been preparing for war since the moment they realized what the Council truly was, because the humans had learned something important in their first year of galactic contact. And it was a lesson that would change everything. They learned that the Council was not a government dedicated to peace and cooperation. It was a protection racket run by ancient species who used their power to exploit and control everyone beneath them. They learned that species who grew too strong or too independent were quietly eliminated by the HFY extinction fleets, and that the galaxy lived in fear of drawing Council attention. They learned that the smiles and the gifts and the promises of friendship were always designed to keep young species docile until they could be properly controlled. And they learned that the only way to survive in this galaxy was to be stronger and smarter and more ruthless than anyone expected. So humanity smiled and signed treaties and played the role of the grateful newcomer while they built an empire in the shadows. They knew that someday the Council would decide that humans were becoming inconvenient, and they knew that when that day came, there would be no mercy and no negotiation. The Council had shown them how the galaxy worked, and humanity had paid attention. Now they were waiting for the moment when they could show the galaxy what humanity could really do. The HFY were the monsters that parents used to frighten their children on 1,000 different worlds across the galaxy. They stood 3 meters tall with 8 limbs that ended in claws capable of tearing through metal, and their bodies were covered in armored plates that could stop most weapons, and their minds had been engineered over millennia to feel nothing but the joy of killing. The Council had created them long ago as the ultimate enforcers, and when a species needed to be reminded of their place in the hierarchy, the HFY were sent to deliver the message. When a species needed to be erased from existence entirely, the HFY extinction fleets would descend upon their worlds and leave nothing behind but ash and silence. In the year 2289, a HFY battle group of 50 warships appeared without warning in the Proxima Centauri system, where humanity had established their largest agricultural colony. Proxima 4 was a peaceful world of farms and greenhouses and processing facilities that produced food for 36 human settlements, and 16 million people called it home. They had no warships and no weapons capable of fighting the HFY, because this was an approved colony in. A system the Council had given humanity permission to use. The attack began at dawn local time, and it was over before noon. The HFY did not issue warnings or demands or ultimatums because that was not their way. They simply opened fire from them. Orbit, and they kept firing until every city was a crater and every farm was a field of glass, and every single one of the 16 million humans on Proxima 4 was dead. Then they broadcast a message to Earth explaining that humanity had been caught developing prohibited biological weapons in violation of the treaty, and that the destruction of Proxima IV was a necessary corrective action to maintain galactic peace. The message was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie, but lies did not matter. When you had the power to destroy worlds, the real reason for the attack was much simpler. Human traders had been too successful in the galactic markets, and human goods were too popular, and human economic growth was beginning to threaten the trade. Monopolies that the Thessian Consortium had maintained for thousands of years. The Thessians had complained to the Council, and the Council had decided that humanity needed to be reminded of their place, and so the HFY had been sent to deliver the message. This was how the galaxy worked, and it had been working this way for 12,000 years. Young species were kept small and weak and obedient, and if they ever forgot their place, they were punished until they remembered the Council. They expected the usual response from humanity. They expected grief and outrage and angry speeches, followed by quiet submission and renewed cooperation. Perhaps the humans would attempt some foolish military gesture that would justify further corrective actions and allow the Council to reduce their territory even more. What the Council did not expect was the response they actually received. 3 days after the destruction of Proxima 4, a single human ship arrived at the Council station, and a single human diplomat requested permission to address the assembled representatives. Her name was Sarah Chun, and she held the rank of admiral in the human military, as well as the title of ambassador to the Galactic Council. She was small even by human standards, barely reaching the chest of most Council species, and she had no claws or fangs or armor or venom. The HFY delegate clicked his mandibles in amusement when she walked into the chamber because she looked like something he could kill with a single swipe of his claw. Ambassador Chun walked to the speaking podium at the center of the chamber, and she looked around at the representatives of 47 species who ruled the galaxy, as she did not seem afraid. High Arbiter Thessian Prime, who led the Council, spoke first in a tone of practiced sympathy. The Galactic Council expressed deep regret for the unfortunate incident at Proxima 4. He said, but the evidence of treaty violations had been clear, and the corrective action had been necessary, and the Council trusted that humanity would learn from this experience and would be more careful to follow the rules in the future. Ambassador Chen listened to this speech without expression, and when the High Arbiter finished, she did not thank him or acknowledge his words. She simply said that 16 million people had lived on Proxima 4, and that they had been farmers and teachers and children, and that the Council had murdered them to send the message. The High Arbiter started to respond that the action had been necessary to maintain galactic order, but Ambassador Chun cut him off. She said that she was not finished speaking. The chamber went silent because no one had ever interrupted the High Arbiter. The four and the HFY delegate rose from his seat with his claws extended, but Ambassador Chun ignored him and continued speaking in a voice that was quiet but somehow filled the entire chamber. She said that the Council had made a mistake, but not a moral one, because the Council clearly did not have the capacity to understand morality. The mistake was tactical. The Council had assumed that humanity was like all the other species they had conquered and controlled over the millennia, and they had assumed that humans would calculate the odds and recognize the superior numbers and submit. She placed a small device on the podium and said that she wanted to show the Council something. The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered, and then it showed an image that made the High Arbiter stop breathing. It showed the HFY homeworld surrounded by a human fleet. Not a small fleet of the primitive ships that humans were supposed to have, but a massive armada of hundreds of warships that did not match any design the Council had ever approved. Ships that had somehow traveled 400 light years across the galaxy without being detected by any of the thousands of sensors and monitoring stations that watched every corner of Council spaceships that were currently positioned to rain destruction down on the home world of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. The HFY delegate made a sound that might have been fear, and the chamber erupted in chaos as representatives shouted and screamed and demanded to know what was happening. Ambassador Chun waited for the noise to die down, and then she spoke again. She said that the destruction of Proxima 4 would be answered, but not today. Today, she had come to teach the Council something that the galaxy seemed to have forgotten. She said that humanity had spent 30 years watching and learning and preparing for this moment, and that they had built an empire in the shadows while the Council congratulated themselves on how well they had tamed the newcomers. She said that the fleet around the HFY homeworld was just a fraction of what humanity had built, and that there were weapons in human arsenals that the Council could not even imagine. She said that humanity could destroy the HFY right now, and that they could turn their homeworld into the same kind of graveyard that Proxima IV had become. But they were not going to do that because humanity was not like the Council. She said that this was a warning, and that the next time the Council sent their monsters to murder human civilians, the response would not be so restrained. Then she looked directly at the HFY delegate, and she smiled in a way that showed her teeth, and she said something that would be remembered for centuries. She said that the Council should never have taught humanity that they were alone in a hostile universe because humans had a very particular response to being threatened. They did not submit, and they did not surrender, and they did not forget. They got stronger, and they got smarter, and they waited for the perfect moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. Ambassador Chun turned and walked out of the chamber, and no one tried to stop her behind her. The holographic display continued to show the human fleet surrounding the HFY homeworld, and the most powerful leaders in the galaxy sat in stunned silence as they realized that everything they thought they knew about humanity had been wrong. The game had changed, and the Council was no longer in control. For the first time in 12,000 years, the masters of the galaxy felt something they had almost forgotten how to feel. They felt afraid. In the days following Ambassador Chun's speech, the Council's intelligence networks worked harder than they had ever worked before. Every spy and every censor and every informant was directed to find out the truth about what humanity had been doing. For the past 30 years, what they discovered made the High Arbiter call an emergency session of the full Council because the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. Intelligence Director Kreleveth stood before the assembled representatives and delivered his report in a voice that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. He began by saying that everything they thought they knew about humanity was wrong. The humans had not colonized 12 worlds as the treaty allowed. They had colonized 247 worlds spread across hidden systems in the unexplored regions of the galaxy where Council sensors did not reach. Their population was not 15 billion as they had claimed in every official report. It was over 300 billion people living on planets and moons and space stations and asteroid habitats that did not appear on any Council chart. Their technology had not remained at the primitive level the Council had approved. Human scientists had reverse-engineered everything the Council had given them, and they had improved upon it in ways that Council researchers could not explain. Human faster than light drives were 3 times faster than Council standard, and they operated on principles that seemed to violate known physics. Human weapons used technologies that Council scientists did not recognize, and some of them appeared to disrupt the fundamental forces that held matter together. Human ships were built with materials that did not exist in any Council database, and their designs incorporated innovations that would have taken other species centuries to develop. But the most disturbing discovery was about human artificial intelligence. The Council had strict laws against advanced AI because thousands of years ago, a machine intelligence had nearly destroyed half the galaxy before being stopped, and since then all member species have been forbidden from developing true artificial consciousness. The humans had ignored this law completely. They had created artificial intelligences that were genuinely conscious and self-aware, and they had integrated these machine minds into every aspect of their civilization. Human ships were crewed by partnerships of biological humans and artificial intelligences, working together in ways that made them far more effective than either could be alone. Human factories were designed and operated by AI systems that could optimize production beyond anything Council species could achieve. Human research was accelerated by machine minds that could process data and generate hypotheses and run simulations millions of times faster than organic brains. The Council had always believed that AI was too dangerous to use, but the humans had found a way to make it work, and that gave them an advantage that could not be easily overcome. Director Krulevith finished his report by admitting that he did not know how the humans had hidden all of this for so long. Every inspection had shown exactly what the Council expected to see, and every report had confirmed that humanity was following the rules, and every spy had reported that the humans were docile and obedient. It had all been a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep the Council blind while humanity built their true strength in the shadows. The High Arbiter demanded to know what should be done, and the chamber erupted into argument as representatives shouted their opinions and their fears. Some wanted to launch an immediate attack with every ship the Council could muster before humanity grew even stronger. Others pointed out that the human fleet was still surrounding the Kethvari homeworld, and that any attack might result in the extinction of the Council's most important military asset. A few suggested negotiation, but they were shouted down by those who insisted that showing weakness would only encourage other species to rebel. The debate went on for hours without resolution because no one had ever faced a situation like this before, and then everything changed again. 3 days after the emergency session, a message was broadcast simultaneously to every communication system in the Orion arm of the galaxy. It reached Council chambers and remote outposts and colony worlds and ships in transit, and there was no way to block it or jam it because it used transmission methods that Council technology could not counter. The message was from humanity, and it was not a declaration of war. It was something far more dangerous. It was an offer. The message began by saying that humanity was not the enemy of the galactic community, but that they refused to be its subjects. For 12,000 years, the Council had maintained order through fear and through the threat of extinction, and they had kept younger species small and weak and obedient, because that made them easier to control. But there was another way to organize a civilization. There was cooperation and mutual respect, and genuine alliance between equals. The message announced the formation of something called the Commonwealth of Free Species. Any species currently under Council authority was invited to join, and membership would be offered not as a privilege granted by the powerful, but as a right belonging to all sentient beings. There would be no population caps and no territorial restrictions and no mandatory technology sharing with overlords who would use it to maintain their dominance. There would be protection for those who needed it and trade that benefited all parties equally, and freedom to grow and expand and develop without asking permission from ancient species who saw everyone else as resources to be managed. The message acknowledged that the Council would see this as a threat and that they would probably respond with force, but humanity was prepared for that response, and they were confident that any species who joined the Commonwealth would be protected from Council retaliation. The message ended with a direct address to the Council leadership. It said that humanity was not asking for the Council to surrender their power. They were asking for something much harder. They were asking the Council to change. They were asking them to dismantle the extinction fleets and end the genetic restrictions and allow free colonization and treat younger species as partners instead of property. They were asking them to become something better than what they had been for 12,000 years. The message said that the Council had 1 year to make their decision. They could reform and join a new galactic order based on cooperation instead of domination. Or they could fight and learn what happened to those who tried to destroy humanity. The choice was theirs. When the message ended, the council chamber was silent. Every representative understood that the galaxy had just changed forever. Some species would accept the human offer, and others would remain loyal to the council, and the result would be a division that could not be easily healed. The High Arbiter looked around at his fellow rulers, and he saw fear in their eyes, and he knew that fear was the only thing that ever held the council together now. That fear was directed at something new, and he was not sure the old order could survive. But he also knew that the council had not ruled for 12,000 years by accepting challenges to their authority. They would fight. They would use every weapon and every ally and every trick they had accumulated over millennia of dominance, and they would show humanity and the entire galaxy what happened to those who dared to defy the masters of the stars. The war that would reshape civilization was about to begin. The council did not wait for the 1-year deadline to expire. Within 3 months, they had assembled the largest military force in galactic history, and they named it the Restoration Fleet, because its purpose was to restore the natural order that humanity had dared to challenge. 40,000 warships gathered at the staging point in the Vesser system, and they represented the combined military power of every species that remained loyal to the council. The Kethvari contributed their extinction fleets because they burned with shame at having their home world threatened by creatures they considered prey. The Veshans provided their commerce raiders and heavy cruisers because their trade empire depended on keeping humanity contained. A dozen other species sent whatever ships they could spare because they feared what the council would do to them if they refused to participate. Fleet Admiral Vorn of the Kethvari was given overall command because his people were the finest warriors in the galaxy, and he had personally led the destruction of 6 species during his long career. He gathered his captains aboard his flagship, and he told them that this battle would be the most important in galactic history. They were not just fighting to destroy humanity, he said. They were fighting to prove that the old order still had the power to crush any challenge, and that rebellion against the council was still suicide. The human Commonwealth had gathered their own fleet in the Vesser Gap, which was a region of space where the stars were thin, and where any attacking force would have to travel through a narrow corridor that limited their ability to use their superior numbers. Intelligence reports suggested that the humans had assembled perhaps 12,000 ships to defend the gap, and Admiral Vaughn calculated that his 40,000 would be more than enough to break through and open the path to human space. He expected losses because the humans had shown surprising capability, but he believed that quantity would overcome quality, and that the Kethvari warrior spirit would triumph over human technology on the morning of the battle. The Restoration Fleet jumped into the Vesser Gap in perfect formation, and Admiral Vorn gave the order to advance. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. The human fleet was exactly where intelligence had predicted, and they were arrayed in a defensive formation that suggested they intended to hold their position rather than advance. Admiral Vorn ordered his ships to close the distance because Kethvari weapons were most effective at short range, and because his warriors were eager to board human vessels and tear their crews apart with claw and fang. Then the humans fired their first volley, and everything changed. Admiral Vorn had studied the reports from the Council's intelligence services, and he thought he understood what human weapons could do. He was wrong. The human weapons did not simply damage ships or punch holes in armor or overload shields. They unmade matter itself. Beams of energy that disrupted the molecular bonds holding atoms together swept across the Restoration fleet, and everything they touched simply ceased to exist. Ships that had survived centuries of warfare vanished in an instant, leaving nothing behind but expanding clouds of disassociated particles. Thousands of HFY warriors who had never known fear discovered what it felt like to watch their comrades disappear as if they had never been. Admiral Vorn ordered evasive maneuvers and return fire, but the human point defense systems were shooting down incoming missiles and energy beams with accuracy that should have been impossible. 99.7% of everything the Restoration fleet fired was destroyed before it reached its target, and the tiny fraction that got through barely scratched human shields. The Admiral ordered boarding operations because surely the HFY could still win in close combat, where their natural advantages would matter. Assault shuttles launched by the thousands, and they raced toward human ships with warriors packed inside, eager to fight and kill and prove their superiority. Some of the shuttles actually reached their targets, and HFY boarding parties breached human hulls and charged inside, expecting to find soft and weak creatures who would fall easily to their claws. What they found instead were humans in powered armor that made them as strong as HFY and as tough as armored vehicles. The humans fought with weapons that fired projectiles capable of punching through HFY plate armor, and they fought with blades that could cut through chitin and bone, and they fought with a ferocity that shocked warriors who had believed themselves the greatest fighters in the Galaxy. HFY, who inflicted wounds that should have killed their opponents, watched in disbelief as humans kept fighting despite injuries that would have incapacitated any other species. Human soldiers whose limbs had been torn off continued to fire their weapons until blood loss finally stopped them. Human Marines who had been impaled on HFY claws used their last breath to detonate grenades that took their killers with them. The boarding operations that were supposed to turn the tide of battle became slaughterhouses where HFY died by the hundreds for every human they managed to kill 4 hours after the battle began. Admiral Vorn ordered a retreat. He had lost 17,000 ships and over 2 million warriors, and he had not managed to destroy a single human vessel. The human fleet did not pursue. They held their position in the Vesser Gap, and they watched the broken Restoration fleet limp away, and they broadcast a message that Admiral Vorn would remember for the rest of his life. The message said that the humans had recovered all HFY survivors from destroyed ships and disabled shuttles. 62,000 wounded warriors were being treated in human medical facilities by doctors who were working to save their lives. 17,000 dead warriors would be returned to their families with full military honors. The message said that this was what the Commonwealth offered, not conquest and not extinction, and not the brutality that the Council had shown to countless species over 12,000 years. Mercy, compassion, the recognition that even enemies were still people who deserved dignity. Admiral Vorn did not understand why the humans were doing this, because in his entire life, he had never seen a victorious army treat its defeated enemies with kindness. But over the following weeks, as wounded HFY returned home and told stories of human doctors who had gentle hands and soft voices and who had treated them with respect instead of contempt, something began to change. Warriors who had been taught since birth to see other species as prey began to wonder if perhaps they had been lied to. Families who had expected to mourn their dead received instead living relatives who spoke of humans not as monsters but as honorable foes who fought hard but showed mercy to the defeated. And across the galaxy, other species watched and listened and began to ask themselves whether the HFY Council deserved their loyalty. Within 6 months, 43 species had defected from the Council to the Commonwealth. The Veshan economy collapsed as human trade routes opened to their competitors and their monopolies crumbled. The HFY military was in shambles, and their warrior Culture was being shaken to its foundations by the realization that there might be more to strength than the ability to kill, and finally the High Arbiters sent a message to the human Commonwealth requesting a meeting to discuss terms. The war was over before it had truly begun. Humanity had won not by destroying their enemies, but by showing them a better way. The signing ceremony took place on Earth because Ambassador Chun insisted that the leaders of the galaxy should see where humanity came from. Ships carrying delegates from 100 different species descended through the atmosphere of the small blue world that had given birth to the beings who had changed everything. The High Arbiter of the Vishan Consortium had never visited a planet so small or so fragile, and as he looked out the window of his shuttle at the white clouds and blue oceans below, he felt a strange sensation that he could not identify. It was humility, and it was something he had not experienced in over 3,000 years of life. The ceremony was held in a place called Geneva, in a building that had once housed something called the United Nations, which had been humanity's first attempt at global cooperation long before they reached the star's ambassador. Chun met the High Arbiter at the entrance, and she escorted him through hallways lined with images from human history. He saw pictures of human wars and human suffering and human cruelty, and he recognized the same patterns that existed in every species, including his own. But he also saw pictures of humans helping each other and healing each other and building together, and he realized that this species contained both darkness and light in measures that seemed impossible to reconcile. The conference room where the treaty would be signed was simple and undecorated because the humans had explained that the importance of the moment did not require elaborate ceremony. Representatives from every species in the new Commonwealth were present, along with delegates from the remaining Council worlds and observers from species who had not yet decided which side to join. The High Arbiter and Ambassador Chun sat across from each other at a plain wooden table, and between them lay the document that would reshape galactic civilization. It was called the Accord of Soul, and it established the framework for a new relationship between the old powers and the young ones. The Council would not be dissolved because humanity recognized that 12,000 years of institutional knowledge should not be discarded simply because some of it had been used for evil purposes. But the Council would be reformed, the extinction fleets would be disbanded, and their ships would be converted to exploration and defense vessels that would protect all species equally. The population caps and territorial restrictions would be eliminated, and every species would be free to grow and expand according to their own choices. The technology sharing agreements would be rewritten so that knowledge flowed freely in all directions instead of being hoarded by the powerful. And most importantly, the Council would no longer rule by fear. Decisions would be made through genuine negotiation and consensus, and no species would have the power to destroy another simply because they had become inconvenient. Before signing the document, the High Arbiter asked Ambassador Chun a question that had been troubling him since the Battle of Vesser Gap. He asked why humanity had not destroyed the Kethvari when they had the chance. He asked why they had shown mercy to warriors who had murdered 16 million of their people on Proxima 4. He asked why they had chosen to heal their enemies instead of exterminating them. Ambassador Chun looked at him for a long moment before answering. She said that the answer required understanding something about human nature that most species found confusing. Humans were capable of great violence and great cruelty, and they had proven this countless times throughout their history. But they were also capable of something else. They were capable of looking at their enemies and seeing themselves. She said that every human child grew up hearing stories about the terrible things that humans had done to each other, and about the wars and genocides and atrocities that filled human history. But they also grew up hearing stories about the humans who had stood against that darkness, the ones who had hidden refugees in their homes knowing they would be killed if they were caught, the ones who had refused to fire on unarmed civilians even when ordered to do so, the ones who had reached across lines of hatred and fear to wine and fear to us, offer help to people their society told them to despise. She said that humanity had learned something from their long and bloody history. They had learned that the cycle of violence and revenge never ended on its own. Someone had to choose to break it. Someone had to look at their enemy and say that this stops here, and that there will be no more killing, and that they would find. Better way, she said that when humanity looked at the HFY, they did not see monsters. They saw a species that had been shaped by their masters into weapons, and who had never been given the chance to be anything else, and humanity had decided to give them that chance. The High Arbiter was silent for a long time after she finished speaking. Then he said something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He said that his species had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. And in all that time, they had never once considered that there might be a better way. They had assumed that power was the only thing that mattered, and that fear was the only tool that worked, and that anyone who showed mercy was simply too weak to do otherwise. But humanity had shown that strength and mercy could exist together. They had won the war by refusing to become the thing they were fighting against. He said that he did not know if his people could learn to be like that, but he was willing to try. Ambassador Chen smiled and extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. The High Arbiter took it. Around them, the representatives of 100 species watched as two civilizations that had been enemies chose to become partners. The document was signed, and the new era officially began. Over the following decades, the galaxy transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. HFY warriors, who had once been instruments of extinction, became protectors of the weak, and their fearsome reputation was turned toward defending colony worlds from pirates and natural disasters. Vesser traders who had once maintained monopolies, through political manipulation, learned to compete fairly and discovered that honest commerce could be even more profitable than corruption. Species that had lived in fear for millennia emerged from their hiding places and contributed their unique gifts to a civilization that welcomed them as equals, and humanity continued to do what they had always done. They explored and they built, and they made mistakes, and they learned from them. They fought when they had to, and they made peace when they could. They reached out to species that had never known friendship, and they showed them that the universe did not have to be a place of fear. 100 years after the Accord of Soul, the galaxy faced a new threat that made everything that had come before seem small. A machine intelligence from the Andromeda galaxy arrived with fleets that darkened the stars and a hunger that had consumed entire civilizations. It called itself the Swarm, and it had been traveling between galaxies for 1,000,000 years, leaving only silence in its wake. The old council would have fractured in the face of such a threat, with each species looking out for itself and abandoning the others to their fate. But the Commonwealth held together. Humans and HFY and Veshans and 100 other species stood side by side, and they faced the Swarm as one civilization united in common purpose. The war lasted 3 centuries, and there were defeats and losses that would be mourned for generations. But in the end, the Commonwealth prevailed, because they had something the Swarm had never encountered in its 1,000,000-year existence. They had each other. They had the willingness to sacrifice for people who were different from them. They had the ability to find hope in the darkest moments and to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. And they had the legacy of a small blue world that had taught the galaxy what it meant to be human. Not the ability to destroy, but the choice to build. Not the instinct for conquest, but the capacity for compassion. Not the certainty of being right, but the humility to learn and grow and change. The stars had belonged to the Council for 12,000 years, and they had used that time to create an empire of fear. Humanity showed them that the stars could belong to everyone and that the future could be something worth hoping for. It started with 16 million dead farmers on a forgotten colony world, and a small woman who stood before the masters of the galaxy and refused to submit. It ended with a civilization that spanned the stars. and that would carry the light of cooperation and hope into the endless darkness. The Council had tried to control humanity. What happened next changed everything, and the galaxy was better for it.